The summer of 1884 had baked the Mimbres Valley down to its bones. The creek was low, the grass was brown, and Gideon Rusk was doing what he did every morning, fixing what broke, checking what shifted, and watching what moved. He was 52 years old, broad across the shoulders and broader across the middle. He wore a silver belly hat gone gray from 100 seasons of sun, and a yellow bandana knotted loose at his throat. He had no family on the property, no hired hand, just the cattle, the land, and the particular kind of silence that settles over a man who has lived long enough to stop expecting company. He was crouched near the wagon trail, reading the ground the way old scouts do, when he heard it. Wheels. Heavy ones. Moving slow. The freight wagon came around the bend with a white flag tied to the front post. 4 armed men rode alongside it. The cargo was covered in canvas, but 2 burlap sacks sat exposed on the rear board, each one stenciled in black letters. CORNSTARCH. Gideon straightened up and watched it pass. A peace gift run. That was what it looked like. Somebody bringing supplies to an Apache camp nearby. Flour, cornmeal, and maybe some blankets, all wrapped in the goodwill of a white flag. He had seen plenty of those over the years, but 4 armed escorts for a cornstarch delivery? That was not goodwill. That was something else. One of the sacks had split along its bottom seam. A thin trail of white powder dusted the wagon road behind the wheels. Gideon walked to it, crouched down, and pinched some between his fingers. He brought it to his nose. It did not smell like cornstarch. It smelled like mineral oil, like gray dust, like the particular bitterness that clung to the air near the silver mines outside Silver City. He had worked around enough blasting crews to know what that combination meant. Dynamite. Fuse oil. The bitter dust that clung to blasting crews after a day in the mines. He stood in the road and watched the wagon disappear around the next bend, the white flag flapping slow and easy in the dry summer air. For a moment, Gideon almost wished he had never bent down to smell that powder. A man can ignore a wagon. He cannot ignore a memory wearing the same white flag. His stomach turned. He had seen a white flag used this way once before. A long time ago, in a different valley, with different people on both sides. He had been younger then. He had seen the wrong being done and said nothing, not one word. And he had carried that silence like a stone in his chest ever since. Now here was a wagon full of explosives dressed up as charity rolling toward an Apache camp, and not a soul in Silver City was going to ask a single question about it. So who was behind it? And more importantly, who was going to stop it? By sundown, that question would no longer belong to Gideon alone. It would belong to a wounded woman hiding in his stable, a frightened boy held as bait, and every soul foolish enough to trust a gift laid under a white flag. He did not sleep that night. He lay on his cot with his boots still on, staring at the ceiling boards, turning the smell of that powder over in his mind. By the time the moon had crossed the window and the coyotes had gone quiet, he had convinced himself twice that he was wrong, and unconvinced himself twice after that. Around midnight he got up, lit a lantern low, and walked out to check the horses. It was the kind of thing a man does when his body needs to move because his mind will not rest. The stable was dark and warm, smelling of hay and old leather. He moved down the row of stalls, running a hand along each flank, listening to the slow breathing of animals unbothered by the world's trouble. He had almost talked himself into going back inside when he heard it. A shift in the shadows behind the stack of old saddle rigging in the far corner. He pulled his revolver and held the lantern up. The person who stepped forward was not a horse thief. She was young, maybe 25, Apache by her dress and her bearing. Her left shoulder had been cut and had not been properly tended. There were marks on her wrists where rope had been, red and raw. Her eyes were steady despite everything, the kind of steady that comes not from calm, but from having already decided that fear was a luxury she could not afford. She said it quietly, almost below the sound of the horses shifting in their stalls. "Please, don't let them do it." Gideon kept the revolver level for one breath, then lowered it. He set the lantern on a post and looked at her the way a man looks when he is trying to decide whether what he is seeing is real. His first thought was that she was running, that Teague or one of his men had grabbed her and she had gotten loose, and now she needed a horse and a head start and somebody to not shoot her in the back. He was wrong. She was not there for herself. Her name was Nayland Docella, and what she told him in the next few minutes, standing in the yellow light of that stable with blood dried on her shoulder and rope burns on her wrists, was not a story about escape. It was a warning. Tomorrow morning, a man named Orban Teague was organizing what he called a peace gift, a gathering at an abandoned storehouse near the Silver City Road. Apache families had been invited to come collect flour, salt, and blankets. There was even a promise that a young Apache boy Teague had been holding as an interpreter would be returned to his people. But Nayland had been forced to help pack the storehouse. She had seen what was underneath the trade goods, beneath the burlap and the stenciled sacks and the folded blankets. Dynamite. Slow fuse. Enough of both to bring the walls down on everyone inside. When the Apache family stepped forward to collect their gifts, Teague intended to light the fuse. Then he would walk away and tell anyone who asked that the Apache themselves had caused the explosion, that the peace offering had been sabotaged, that the valley was no longer safe. Two things would follow. The Apache who had been quietly opposing his takeover of the water rights along Mimbres Creek would be dead, and the town of Silver City would have all the reason it needed to push every remaining Apache family out of the valley for good. Gideon stood very still for a long moment. Then he asked the only question that mattered right then. "How much time do we have?" Nayland looked toward the stable door, where the dark was already thinning at the edges. Her answer came out flat, and that made it worse. "Less than we need." If you have been with us this far, you already know this channel is not about quick stories. It is about the ones that stay with you. The ones where ordinary people, flawed and tired and carrying old mistakes, find themselves standing at a moment that cannot be walked away from. If that is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe now and hit the bell. Every week we bring you another piece of the American West that most history books never bothered to write down. Now let us get back to Gideon, because the sun is already rising over Mimbres Valley, and Teague's wagon is already on the road. His first instinct was the law. Get her on a horse, ride into Silver City before dawn, and put the whole story in front of the sheriff. Let the badge handle it. That was how things were supposed to work. Nayland stopped him before he reached for the bridle. She said it without raising her voice, which made it land harder. Teague had already handled the law. He had a freight contract with the county, paper records that made every supply run look legitimate, and at least 2 men who wore lawman clothing but took Teague's wages. If they rode into Silver City with her word against his, they would not make it to a hearing. Teague would know within the hour. And once he knew, Nayland would disappear before sunrise. The peace gift would happen anyway, right on schedule, with nobody left to interrupt it. Gideon stood with his hand on the stall post and thought it through. She was right. He knew men like Teague. He had watched them operate in every territory he had ever passed through. They did not survive by being careless. They survived by making sure the paperwork was always in order, and the witnesses were always on their side. He reached up and pulled off his hat, running a hand through what was left of his gray hair. The lantern light caught the yellow bandana at his throat. Nalen's eyes stopped there. Something changed in her face. Not panic, not anger. Something slower and colder than either one. She said, "I know that color." He did not pretend not to understand her. Years ago, before the ranch, before he had gotten too old and too heavy for long rides, Gideon Rusk had scouted for the Army. He had led columns through passes and across dry washes, reading terrain for men in blue uniforms who did not always use his knowledge for good. He had not pulled a trigger in the incident she was thinking of. He had not given an order. But he had been there. He had seen the white flag. He had smelled the wrongness of it the same way he had smelled that powder on the road today. And he had said nothing. He told her that plainly. No performance of guilt, no reaching for her sympathy. Just the flat truth of it, spoken into the stable air between them. Nalen looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Men like you always remember too late." It was not said with heat. It was said the way you state something that has simply proven itself true too many times to argue about. That was what made it cut. Gideon put his hat back on. He did not defend himself. There was nothing to defend. She was not wrong. That was the hardest part about guilt. Sometimes it did not need a judge, a rope, or a jail cell. Sometimes it only needed one woman to say the truth out loud. He said, "Then let's make sure this time is different." She did not agree. She did not nod or soften. But she did not walk out of the stable either. And in the dark of that summer night, with the clock already running toward morning, that was enough to move on. Teague had chosen his location well. That was the first thing Gideon noticed, and it made his blood go colder. A careless man chooses a place to meet. A guilty man chooses a place to control who lives long enough to tell the story. The abandoned storehouse sat back from the Silver City Road just far enough to feel private, just close enough to look official. By the time Gideon arrived on foot, moving slow and easy like a man who had wandered over out of curiosity, the setup was already in place. A long table out front, stacked with burlap sacks and folded blankets. The white flag hung above the door, catching the morning breeze. 3 townspeople stood off to one side, arms crossed, brought in to serve as witnesses to Teague's generosity. Teague himself stood near the table, in a clean vest and a marshal's badge that caught the sun. He was younger than Gideon by 15 years, and carried himself the way men do when they have never once doubted that the room belongs to them. The Apache group came from the direction of the dry creek bed. Small, cautious. 2 elder men and several women. Near Teague's table stood a boy of maybe 10, the one Teague had been holding as an interpreter, with one of Teague's men close enough to grab his collar if he moved too fast. They move the way people move when they want to believe the offer is real, but their bodies remember every time it was not. Gideon positioned himself between the table and the storehouse door. He spoke loud enough for the Apache group to hear, casual as he could manage. He said he would not recommend touching anything on that table. Teague turned to him with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He told the witnesses that Gideon Rusk was a lonely old drunk who had been spending too much time with Apache women. He said it pleasantly, the way a man does when he wants the insult to sound like concern. The witnesses laughed, a little uncertainly. That little laugh nearly cost them everything. It gave Teague exactly what he wanted. A room full of people willing to doubt the warning before they doubted the man wearing the badge. Then Nalen came around the far corner of the storehouse. She moved fast and without hesitation, pointing to the base of the wall where a slow fuse ran beneath a warped floorboard, barely hidden, disappearing into the darkness under the building. She pulled back the corner of a burlap sack on the table, showing the fresh stitching along its bottom seam, the seam that had been opened, packed with something that was not cornstarch, and sewn back shut. Teague stopped smiling, and for the first time that morning, everyone saw the real man beneath the clean vest. Not a peacekeeper, not a contractor, just a gambler whose trick had been named before the cards were turned. He said one word to the man nearest him. What followed was not elegant. Gideon had not been in a real fight in years, and his body reminded him of that immediately. But he had spent 30 years in rough country, and he knew something that younger men sometimes forgot, which was that a heavy man who commits fully to a direction is very difficult to stop. He took the first man low and hard, driving him back into the corner of the table with his shoulder. The table edge caught the man across the kidneys, and he went down. The second man came at him from the left, and Gideon caught him with the flat stock of his shotgun across the forearm. Not graceful, but sufficient. Nayland had already reached the boy. She cut the loose rope at his wrist with a small blade and pulled him away from the storehouse wall, putting herself between him and the men still standing. Teague reached for the lamp hanging inside the doorframe, pretending to steady it against the morning breeze. But Gideon saw his other hand drop low, toward the dark line of fuse tucked beneath the warped floorboard. Gideon saw it and moved, but not fast enough. One of Teague's men caught him from the side with a knife, short and mean, finding the gap below his ribs. He staggered, but did not go down. He put one hand against the wall and kipped his feet. Nayland turned. She grabbed a handful of loose powder from one of the split sacks and threw it hard into the knife man's face. The man reeled back, pawing at his eyes. Gideon swung the shotgun barrel at the iron hook holding the table supports in place. The hook snapped. The table collapsed sideways, sending sacks and blankets and the careful arrangement of Teague's generosity sliding across the dirt. Underneath, visible now to every witness standing in that yard, were the bricks of dynamite, the coiled fuse, and the blasting caps packed neatly between the floorboards. Gideon also saw a narrow wire running from beneath the storehouse toward the wagon, half buried in the dust. That was when he understood the uglier part of Teague's plan. The storehouse was not the whole trap. It was only the part meant to be seen after everyone inside was already dead. The three townspeople did not move. They just stared. And in that moment of stillness, with the evidence lying open in the morning sun, Teague made the only decision a man like him knows how to make when the performance falls apart. He ran for the wagon. Nayland shouted Gideon's name, but he was already moving. Not fast, not pretty, just forward, like a man who had spent half his life running from one morning and had finally found the place where he could stop. If you want more stories from the Old West where the truth comes out the hard way, subscribe before the dust settles. Now stay with Gideon, because Teague is running, and that wagon still has one last secret. Gideon went after him. He was bleeding, and he knew it, a wet warmth spreading under his shirt on the left side. But he had enough left in him for one more effort, and he intended to use it. Teague had a younger man's legs and a head start, but the wagon was 30 yards out and hitched to a single horse that had not been untied. Teague was going for the second detonator. Gideon understood that without having to think about it. He caught him at the wagon wheel. Behind him, no one cheered. No one even breathed loud. The whole yard seemed to understand that if Gideon failed here, the truth would be buried under smoke before it ever reached Silver City. What followed was not the kind of fight that gets remembered fondly. Two men in the dirt beside a wagon in the summer heat, one bleeding, one desperate, both too committed to quit. Teague was faster and landed cleaner. Gideon was harder to finish. He took 2 hits that would have sat a younger man down and kept moving forward, which had always been his one reliable talent. He got his hand on Teague's wrist just as the man reached for the detonator box on the wagon floor. Gideon pulled the yellow bandana from his own throat with his free hand, wrapped it twice around Teague's wrist, and wrenched sideways with everything he had left. Teague's hand cracked against the iron wagon wheel. The detonator dropped into the dirt. Gideon put a knee on Teague's chest and stayed there, breathing hard, until the man stopped fighting. By the time the dust settled, 2 of the townspeople had gone for Fort Bayard and the Grant County Sheriff. The 3rd stood guard over Teague's men with a rifle he had not fired in years, and an expression that suggested he was prepared to start. Nayland pulled the canvas tarp from the wagon bed. Beneath it was everything Teague had spent months assembling. Ledgers with falsified supply records, land transfer documents for the water rights along Mimbres Creek, signed under names that did not hold the authority to sign them. A list of Apache families accused in writing of horse theft, the accusations undated and ready to be filed whenever they became useful. Receipts for payments made to 3 men whose names were listed on the county deputy rolls. The witnesses saw all of it. They did not need anyone to explain what they were looking at. When the soldiers arrived from Fort Bayard and the sheriff rode in from Silver City, Teague was arrested on the ground beside his own wagon. Not on Gideon's word, not on Nayland's, on the contents of the wagon he had driven to his own operation that morning. That was the end of Orban Teague's arrangement with Mimbres Creek, but it was not the end of what he had broken. Men like Teague rarely leave only bodies behind. They leave suspicion, hunger, empty crossings, and people who do not know if the next white flag means peace or another grave. In the days that followed, Nayland stayed at the ranch. Her shoulder needed proper tending, and the boy needed a quiet place before he could be returned to his family. Gideon was not much of a nurse, and even less of a host. He tried not to hover over her, which mostly meant hovering from farther away. Nayland noticed. She said nothing. That was mercy enough. He burned one side of the cornbread the first evening and served it anyway, without apology. Nayland looked at the blackened crust and said nothing, but something in her face shifted, just barely, the way a dry gate creaks once before it finally gives. One afternoon, she took the yellow bandana from where it had been left on the porch rail. She washed it in the basin by the well, working the blood stain out slowly and completely, then brought it back and tied it at Gideon's throat with the same hands that had cut a boy's rope that morning. She said, "This time, you spoke." It was not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the clean way men like Gideon hoped for. But it was a door left open. And after all those years, that was more than he deserved. He looked at her for a moment before he answered. "Too late for some. Not too late for you." She did not reply to that. She did not need to. When morning came, she was still there. And Gideon, who had spent years waking to an empty house and an old silence, did not move for a long while. He only sat by the window, watching the first light touch the Mimbres Valley, knowing some debts could never be paid back, only answered differently when the next test came. That sack of pinole is what sticks in my craw. Not the gun smoke, not even Woolsey's name. It's that little bag of cornmeal sitting there under a white flag, pretending to be peace while men were getting ready to spill blood. That's an ugly kind of trick. Cowardly, too. Now, history ain't clean on every detail. Some folks say strychnine was mixed in. Some say that part came later, frontier talk growing teeth over time. Some say the dead were Apache. Others say Yavapai, Tonto Apache, or native folks white settlers just lumped together because they couldn't be bothered to know who they were killing. But January 1864, out in Arizona Territory, near the Superstition Mountains, something bad happened. Woolsey's civilian rangers called men in for a parley, and at least 24 native people ended up dead. Maybe more than 30. Woolsey lost 1 man. That ain't negotiation. That's murder dressed up in frontier paperwork. And I'll tell you this, Once a white flag gets used as bait, every honest peace talk after it has to drag that sin behind it. So here's my question. When peace comes carried by armed men, who in their right mind should trust it?